It's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. A second Conservative candidate is being looked into by regulators over a bet relating to the timing of the general election.
Well, obviously, it's a very far from ideal situation.
This candidate should be suspended.
Comes amid more dire polling for the Conservatives and the Prime Minister, and other leaders having to face the question time audience tonight. Also today,
the main parties are all talking about house building today. Here at BBC Verify, we'll be comparing their plans and whether they're achievable.
And I'm at a climbing centre in Sheffield, finding out what young voters make of the election so far.
joining us today, Conservatives, Sir Charles Walker, Shadow Treasury Minister James Murray, Liberal Democrat Deputy Leader Daisy Cooper and former Conservative advisor Mercy Muroki. This is Politics Live Election 2024. Welcome. Just to inform our viewers and our guests that we will be coming to the important story that's been unfolding all morning about the Gambling Commission investigating and looking at questions relating to bets being placed by Tory candidates on the timing of the general election. We're waiting for the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason, who is on his way into the building, who will bring us up to date. In the meantime, let's have a look at the Guardian headline, because the Bank of England has held interest rates at 5.25%. The decision comes despite a fall in the rate of inflation, as you know, yesterday to 2% target at the Bank of England last month. Now, it's the seventh consecutive month that the Bank of England have held rates at 5.25%. There had been discussion over the last few months that they might cut rates. It now looks as if that's going to be postponed until later on, perhaps at the end of the summer. It'll come as a blow to many mortgage payers who need to refinance their loans soon, but savers may well welcome the decision to leave rates on hold. All of this, of course, part of a very important issue at this election, and that is housing. And today, all the main parties have been promoting their plans to build more homes in the next Parliament. Let's cross now to BBC Verify and our correspondent Ben Chu. Ben, hello to you. You've been looking at the parties' manifestos and how they compare.
That's right, Joe. So how many new houses are the biggest political parties pledging to build in the next Parliament? Well, national government house building targets in recent years have generally related to a measure called net additional dwellings in England. Now, the Conservatives have had a formal target of 300,000 a year on this measure, and the most recent data for 2022-23 shows a shortfall against that target of around 65,000. And projections from the Construction Products Association suggest that due to the spike in interest rates and the slump in housing construction starts, the shortfall will widen in 2024-25 to around 120,000. But despite this record, the Conservatives have pledged to more than achieve their 300,000 per year target in the next Parliament, pledging 1.6 million new homes in England over the next 5 years. And that amounts to 320,000 new homes per year. And Labour, well, they've pledged 1.5 million new homes in their manifesto, again in England, so have essentially recommitted to the 300,000 target. The Liberal Democrats, meanwhile, pledged 380,000 new homes built per year, including 150,000 new social homes, though this would be across the UK, not just England, so it's not strictly comparable. Though the big picture is that all three parties are making big and ambitious pledges in terms of numbers. But how credible are they? Well, they all promise to speed up planning, but that's much easier said than done, as recent history attests. The Conservatives also say they would scrap stamp duty for many first-time buyers and bring back the Help to Buy equity loan scheme for first-time buyers, although this did not have a radical impact on construction last time it was tried in 2013 by George Osborne. The Liberal Democrats, well, they pledged to properly fund local authority planning departments to speed up the bureaucracy, which could help, though the party has not promised to increase public grants for social house building, despite its huge target in that area. And Labour, they have a specific pledge to bring back local authority house building targets, which were scrapped by the Conservatives, and to build on what they call the grey belt, which is essentially wasteland, currently classified as green belt, which again analysts think could potentially make a difference to supply. Though it's worth noting that between 2000 and 2010, Labour built slightly few net new dwellings on average per year than the Conservatives did between 2010 and 2022, 176,000 versus 197,000. So, among housing specialists, there's some scepticism over whether any of the party's home building targets are achievable. They point to those long-standing planning obstacles, the rise in building material costs and other factors such as a shortage of construction workers. But there's another question. How much would any of this actually help young people buy houses, even if such targets were achieved? Bear in mind that the home ownership rate of those aged 25 to 34 in the UK in 2022 was around 40%. At the turn of the millennium, it was close to 60%, though the rate is up from its low point of 33% hit in 2015. Most economists do think that a sustained increase in house building would, over the longer term, make housing more affordable and is a sensible government objective. Yet they caution against assuming rapid impacts on house prices and big rises in home ownership rates. And they stress the importance of policy looking after renters as well as trying to help more younger people onto the housing ladder. Joe.
Ben Chu, thank you very much. Now, it's been a huge area of interest for BBC audiences, unsurprisingly, because obviously it affects every one of us one way or another. And that has been demonstrated and highlighted through the steady stream of people contacting Your Voice, Your Vote, which we have been running during this campaign. Questions have been sent in for the politicians. Let's just hear from one viewer and then we'll get the politician's response.
Hello, I'm Edward, I'm 24 and from London. 40 years ago, it would take just 3 years for an average couple to save enough money for a deposit on their first house. Today it would take 9 years, or 15 years if you live in London, with young people and those whose parents rented disproportionately affected. Demand subsidising schemes like Help to Buy clearly haven't helped enough. So how will politicians ensure that enough new housing is being built to meet our needs?
Charles, let me start with you. What would you say in response to Edward?
So I have 3 children, 2 definitely in their house buying range, the same as Edward is. So I'm very pro house building. I welcome the fact that all of the manifestos talk about building more homes. I don't think any of them, including ours, are ambitious enough. But I do congratulate all parties for wanting to get more homes built. But it is going to be enormously difficult. When the Green Belt was established really in 1955, the population of this country was about 51 million. It's now 68 million, so it's grown by 35%. And we cannot just preserve everything in aspic, I'm afraid. And yes, it's really good to develop brownfield sites, but they're expensive to clear up, they're expensive to develop. We will have to start looking at the Green Belt, and we will all have to have the courage to make the argument to current homeowners that when they bought their home, they did not buy the right to stop other people having a home.
Is that what's been happening?
Look, all of us in Parliament talk about the need to build houses, and yet when it comes to the crunch, certainly many of us then start campaigning against housing developments in their constituencies.
Right, I'll come back to you in a moment about what has to happen. What would you say directly to Edward?
What I'd say to Edward is that the experience he's having is one that lots of people right across the country are having. He's not alone in that. This is a problem facing people, yes, in London, but also in other places right across the UK. And what we need to do is have a plan to tackle it. And that's why we've been really focused, not just on the target, but also how do we get there? So how do we get there? By reintroducing the housing targets, by strengthening planning departments, but also by helping to make sure that we've got a mortgage guarantee scheme for first-time buyers to help them get on the property ladder, and at the same time reforming private renting. Because I don't know Edward's circumstances, but I guess a lot of people like him will be stuck renting privately. And when they're renting privately for a long time, it's hard to put away a deposit. They lack security, sometimes have poor conditions, so that needs attention too.
Right. Daisy, what would you say directly to Edward?
Well, look, our planning system is completely broken. And at the moment, we have a top-down planning system that doesn't deliver the homes that we desperately need, but does destroy swathes of the Green Belt. And so what I would say to Edward in particular is, first of all, we need to tackle the affordability problem in our housing market, and we do that by building 150,000 social homes per year. What we would like to see is for local councils to have more powers to regulate existing housing stock. So in my area, for example, we have the absurd position where really big freeholders can own 20, 30, 40, 50 flats, and they use them all as Airbnbs, and they're taken out of the market for young people and young families to either rent or buy. And that could be a power that could be given to local authorities. I tried to get that into the government's Levelling Up bill, and they ignored it. So there are ways in which you could actually bring some of the existing housing stock into the market. You've got to build those 150,000 social homes to tackle the affordability problem as well.
Mercy, is any of this deliverable?
Well, all parties seem to be promising roughly the same thing, and I think, Charles said it, it's not ambitious enough, really. And for me, as one of the young people who fit into that bracket, it is about affordability. Now, I'm lucky enough that I managed to, because of a sort of series of lucky circumstances, buy my own house 2 years ago. But looking at interest rates, how they are now, looking at the cost of housing for people who especially are buying in places down south and in London, there's no way if people of my generation can even afford to save the sorts of deposits that you're asking for. So I'd like to see parties that actually talking about that side of things as well.
Right. I mean, Charles, what you said about people who have homes, existing property owners, being told they don't have the right to say no more planning or building in my backyard. Now, that is easy to say, but when all of you as prospective MPs, I know you have been an MP and you're not standing again in this election, have constituents that say, I don't want houses being built around me. What do you do?
So in my constituency, former constituency of Broxbourne, I lived in the village of Goffs Oak, and we've taken a huge number of houses over the 19 years that I've lived there, because it's not my responsibility to stop people having a home and a front door to call their own. Indeed, villagers would email me saying, Charles, we want you to oppose this development. And I would say, look, as a matter of course, planning is for the local authority. So I don't get engaged. But if you want me to get engaged, it will be on the side of the new house builders, not those who want to prevent other families from moving.
So that's what you didn't
village.
oppose. I mean, have you ever opposed? I mean, we have examples of most MPs, former MPs, now candidates, who have opposed developments in their backyard.
I can think of a good example. I won't go into all the detail because it's very local, but it's a good example in my constituency where the question wasn't if we should build, it's what and how we should build. And actually, in this particular one I'm thinking of, local people wanted redevelopment to happen, realised it needed to happen, but they didn't like the design, the low levels of affordability, the problems of infrastructure. And that's why I think one of the crucial things in our manifesto is about moving from if housing should be built to how.
Right, but you did oppose a development on former Waitrose site, I think, of 2 tower blocks in West Ealing of 428 homes, including 83 affordable homes. Why?
83 affordable out of 400. It's not enough affordable housing. It's a big site there, and we were saying this needs to be designed well. We need to have good affordable housing, and that's the position the council in this case in my local area has a clear plan about affordable housing, and they weren't meeting it.
Right, but the problem is objections just mean houses aren't built, affordable or otherwise. Maybe that's not a problem. I mean, Daisy, you opposed St Stephen's and Chiswell Green housing developments for 721 new homes, including up to 330 discounted affordable homes. Why?
I can tell you very specifically on that case, because that case was being considered when the government was reviewing its national planning policy framework. The government was promising to bring in protections for greenbelt sites, and I requested the Secretary of State to call in that application pending changes in the national planning policy framework. It then turned out that the government didn't put extra protections in for the greenbelt, and he gave the go-ahead to that site on that basis. So actually, there was a legitimate reason to say...
But Daisy, you will understand that politicians sit here and always say, there's a particular reason for me objecting to this planning application. There's a particular circumstance why it can't happen, and that's why not enough homes have been built.
Part of the problem here is the planning system puts all the power in the hands of the developers, and it doesn't put power in the hands of communities. And there are communities around the country who feel as though planning and house building is being done to them and not with them. And when the infrastructure doesn't come, people just see huge numbers of houses, but without the GPs, without the school places, without without the additional infrastructure in the roads, and that's part of the problem. So if you had a community-led development system where you work with communities to identify what houses you actually need, not just the demand, but the houses you need, then there are examples around the country where that works well and where communities are in favour of building the right homes.
Charles?
To be honest, the other thing we need to do is we need to address the education system. We need to get more children, more youngsters into vocational courses where they learn to house build. We have a further education college in my constituency where I was looking at, I think, NVQ level 2 bricklayers 2.5–3 years ago who were starting on £200 a day laying bricks. There is huge opportunity for youngsters in the building trade, and we need to make it a more attractive, and we need to explain to them the opportunities that reside within it.
Right. James?
If I can just come back on this, because I think actually the examples that I'm thinking of in my constituency are really good examples of how we should approach things better, because in this case the local council, has a draft local plan which says what densities can go on what sites, how it should be designed, the level of affordable. Developers then need to take a steer from that and say, right, we need to deliver affordable housing and follow this plan which has been decided by the democratically elected local government.
But Keir Starmer has said that the Labour Party, if they get into government, will bulldoze through planning applications. What does that mean in practice?
That means that planning applications should not be sat there for months and years and not be decided. If someone comes in with a planning application, at the moment, these things don't get decided, they don't get implemented, and they sit on shelves for far too long. And that's why we need to have extra resource and capacity in planning departments, and we set out our plan to fund that.
Is that deliverable, Charles?
Look, I think it's very difficult. So when members of parliament get elected, new members of parliament and returning members of parliament, doesn't matter what party they are, if they've won a seat or not, they will be captured by vested interests. And they've got to have the courage to say, no, actually, it is my duty to get houses built for your children and grandchildren. And you know what? It's a difficult conversation to have, but you're respected when you have it.
Right. I mean, in terms of deliverability, we heard there from my colleague Ben Chew saying even if you build the numbers of houses that all the three main parties are talking about, it won't necessarily lead to a drop in prices, desirable or not, or a huge surge in terms of house ownership. I mean, does that leave you feeling dispirited or an acceptance that they're not ambitious enough, your plans?
Well, fundamentally, what we have is an affordability crisis. We have, I'll give you an example from my own area. We've got a lot of people who are living in overcrowded homes, and we have a desperate need for 3- and 4-bed homes in and around the area where I live. But you have people living in 1- and 2-bed flats where it's overcrowded, and yet you have developers who are building 6- and 7-bed executive homes, which are not the homes that we need, and they're not the homes that local people can afford.
Right. I don't know how you stop that. I mean, St Albans is one of the most expensive areas outside of London. Are you going to tell your constituents, if you're re-elected, I'm campaigning to bring house prices down by building more homes here?
No, what we're saying is, my promise to local constituents is that we want to change the planning system so it is a community-led planning system. Communities understand the frictions here. Communities want their families and their children and their elderly parents to be able to live in the same area. The problem is that the homes that are being built do not reflect the homes that you actually need in the local area and don't bring the infrastructure with them.
Mercy?
Well, I am sitting here listening to everybody, and I think these are the conversations that have been taking place during every election, and the public, what the public will be hearing are things being rehashed that they've been told by every politician of every colour for years. And that's why I'm saying it's disappointing that there hasn't been more ambitious or more creativity when it comes to how we actually solve the housing issue, because I'm not hearing anything that hasn't really been said before.
I mean, do you want to see prices come down? Is that what's needed? That prices across the board, not immediately, over time, that you build so many homes, prices come down, your kids can afford.
But the market, to some extent, will dictate that. It's not a question about we want to see prices coming down. I'm a capitalist. I want to see... I know there's absolutely, I believe, in a mixed model, social, affordable, shared ownership, but I'm a capitalist. I want to see young people have a stake in this country, in society, a capital stake. And the best and quickest way of doing that is through home ownership. And it's no coincidence that the level of support for my party is collapsing or has collapsed amongst young people. We've got to show them that the Conservative way is to allow them to build capital and wealth that allows them to have better choices and do better things in their lives.
Well, let me just put another question, because it's also about the impact on local environment. 50-year-old Lance Patterson from Norfolk sent us a question. Does any party have a coherent plan for farming the countryside and limiting the creep of cities while providing for new affordable housing? James?
Well, I think that speaks to the question about Greenbelt. And what we've said in our manifesto is that we want brownfield first. We want to make sure that brownfield is always the first option for building new homes, but that local leaders should be looking at what land they're using for their housing capacity in the future. And in some cases, that might involve declassifying what we're terming grey belt. So this is very poor quality green belt. Sometimes it's already built on, it's already paved, hard surfaced and so on, and potentially putting in other areas which are proper green belt into the mix. And this is a way of making sure that the land supply is there in local areas. Because if I just give you one example, there was a case in the southeast where, because of the planning designation, they built on a playing field rather than a car park, because the car park happened to be defined as green belt and the playing field wasn't, and that just seems wrong.
All right, let's just show you the candidates in St Albans, since we've been talking about your constituency. I can still say it. There is, I think, another page to go on to. There it is, the full list of candidates in St Albans. And I think we can also show you the slate for Ealing North. If it doesn't appear on the screens, then it is... Oh, here it comes. List of candidates in Ealing North, which is James's former constituency. There, again, are the list of candidates. And, of course, you can look at those on the BBC website. Now, I said that we would wait to discuss the further developments in the story relating to bets being placed on the timing of the general election until our political editor, Chris Mason, have made it into the building. Well, I'm pleased to say I can see him, and there he is. Chris, I'll just show the headline here. BBC News candidate looked into over election bet, married to Tory campaign's official. Bring us up to date with what's been going on this morning.
Yeah, morning to you, afternoon to you. Let me walk you through sort of how I've sort of revealed this story over the best part of 24 hours. I had a tip-off yesterday afternoon around this whole question of bets being placed on the timing of the general election. I was able to establish yesterday afternoon that a serving Metropolitan Police officer in the Prime Minister's close protection team had been suspended and later arrested around all of this, and the Gambling Commission were looking into him. In addition to that, later last night, I managed to establish that a Conservative candidate, Laura Saunders, who's standing in Bristol Northwest, full list of candidates there, also on the BBC News website, was being looked into by the Gambling Commission. She has worked for the Conservative Party, including at Party HQ, since 2015. This morning, I worked out who Laura Saunders was married to, which is a guy called Tony Lee, who is the Conservative Party's Director of Campaigning. He took a leave of absence from that role yesterday afternoon. And in the last hour or so, I've established that Mr. Lee is also being looked into by the Gambling Commission.
They've talked about inquiries into a small number of individuals. Now, I don't know what one's definition is of a small number, but does that imply that there are others who may be questioned as part of this?
I think it leaves open the possibility that there may be others. I don't know of any others, to be clear, and I should say, in the interests of fairness and sort of journalistic transparency, we have approached all of those involved, Laura Saunders and Mr. Lee, both directly and via the Conservative Party for comment, and they haven't commented. The Conservative Party has acknowledged publicly that the Gambling Commission had approached them about some cases, and they have left it for the Gambling Commission to complete their work before what I suspect will be kind of human resources related things that the party themselves will do after that.
Right, stay with us, Chris, because there's more to discuss. But Charles, your reaction? A nightmare for the party.
Well, firstly, thank God I didn't place a bet on the date of the general election. But if I had, it would have been November with a side bet on December the 12th. I don't want to diminish this, but outside the constituency where this young woman is standing, it will make not a jot's worth of difference to the general election result. It really won't. This is good knockabout stuff, but come July 4th, nobody is going to change their vote off the back of this. They really aren't, to be honest. That's not to diminish its importance today in the general election news cycle, But look, we're here to talk about really serious things, and this isn't in the pantheon of seriousness really getting much through the front door of this general election.
And that's because you're assuming defeat for the Conservatives?
No, I'm not. But look, we've just had a really important conversation about house building. I think, look, we're all in the same or similar places. Some of us want to be more ambitious. We've got maybe different ideas. And that should be part of the general election debate. And hopefully that's what people are tuning into and will be tuning into tonight.
But, Charles, what about the morale in the party and for those who are out knocking on doors campaigning with this going on?
I've got to be honest, look, I've done 6 general elections, my first in Ealing North, by the way, where I got soundly thrashed in 2001. But when I'm out knocking on doors and my team are out knocking on doors, this will get some attention, but quite frankly, you're fighting very localised campaigns, often on local issues. I don't want to diminish this, but really, given the huge things at stake in this general election, it will be a ripple, not a wave.
Well, Chris, interesting listening to what Charles is saying, that this won't have a sort of, if not a direct impact, then a significant impact. But we will find out a snapshot of reaction because, of course, the Prime Minister can't hide, even if he wanted to, away from this. He and the other leaders of the 4 main parties are facing a Question Time special this evening.
Yeah, not only that, but in God's own county. It's going to be in York later on. 2 hours on BBC One between 8 and 10 with Ed Davey and John Swinney, Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak all doing half an hour in front of a live audience. Hey, it's intriguing, isn't it, just picking up on Charles's point, is the extent to which things like this, stuff like this in a campaign, makes much difference. The one observation I would make, and I'm not seeking to dispute what Charles is saying, who knows is the honest answer, is that it grabs attention, this stuff, and it means in this instance the Conservative Party, can't be talking about what it might prefer to talk about rather than stuff that's alleged to be going on, or has gone on allegedly within their own building.
Chris Mason, thank you very much. And let me just remind you of the details of the Question Time special. You can see here the trail. There are the 4 leaders. It'll be hosted by Fiona Bruce, and there will be live audience with questions with each of those leaders tonight. Let me just get a reaction briefly from you, James, and you, Daisy, to what's been going on.
Well, I think the reason why it's important is because what it says about the Prime Minister, about Rishi Sunak, about him not suspending the 2 candidates. We had a police officer who was facing a similar allegation, suspended, arrested. You have 2 people who are standing for the Conservative Party in the election, not suspended. Now, what does that say about the Prime Minister? What does that say about what he's willing to tolerate in his own party? Keir Starmer said this morning, if it had been someone in the Labour Party, their feet wouldn't have touched the ground. They would have been suspended straight away. And I think it speaks to a wider issue about Rishi Sunak and his weakness as a Prime Minister.
Daisy?
Well, these clearly are very worrying revelations, and of course the Prime Minister should suspend the candidates and also needs to come clean about how many cases have been raised with him and suspend anybody else who may be facing those inquiries. But I think, just to challenge Charles's point, people may not remember the specifics of what's been reported today, but it is part of a broader drumbeat, isn't it, that the Conservatives day after day are having a bad campaign, that this is of course a parliament within which the Conservative Party took a wrecking ball to standards in public life. We had the Partygate episode where it was one rule for them, one rule for everybody else, and it just feeds into that narrative that this is a party that is out of touch, that thinks that it is one rule for them and one rule for everybody else.
Do you want to respond, Charles?
Well, look, it's not ideal, is it? But the lovely thing about not being a combatant is that I can step back from heaping opprobrium on someone who may well have made a very serious mistake and they're bitterly regretting it. But it's not ideal. But as I say, it will be a ripple, not a wave. And I don't blame any political opponent from making hay. I mean, this is, it's hand-to-hand combat in a general election campaign. That's what's happened. That's what happens. But as I say, as not a combatant in this one, I can be slightly more magnanimous in my approach to this.
Mercy?
Yeah, actually, I've written in today's Sun about the declining standards in public life, and we've seen, I think, over 15 suspensions since the last general election, suspensions from parliaments for MPs, not just Conservative MPs. There's clearly been something going terribly wrong, not just with elected MPs, but with candidates. We've already seen Keir Starmer having to suspend a candidate over some dodgy pro-Russian tweets. We've seen candidates from Reform having questions around things they've said. One candidate had, I think, tweeted something in support of Hitler. So when the public looks at politicians, whether they're elected or whether they're standing to be elected, what they see is people who just aren't very good, people who aren't necessarily worthy of representing the country. And I think it's no surprise at all that trust in politicians is lower than ever before, and people don't trust politicians to tell the truth, and they don't trust government as a whole. So I would hope, you know, whoever ends up being the leader of the governing party, or whoever ends up being the governing party, can do something to fix this, to fix standards in public life.
Well, let's get a view from Sheffield, because BBC News reporter Jim Connolly is at a climbing wall and perhaps can get a flavour of what some of those who are literally climbing the walls are thinking about this election and politicians. Jim, over to you.
Hi there, Joe. Yeah, we're going to spend the next 5 minutes trying not to make jokes about people clinging onto power, mountains to climb. We've come here because we wanted to chat to some younger people. And we know that climbing is a massive sport, a growing sport, participation-wise, amongst young people. So there's plenty of young people to grab in the background whilst they're doing a little bit of climbing here. And to give you an idea about Sheffield, at the last election, it had 6 MPs, 5 of which were Labour and 1 was the Conservative. So a very Labour-dominated area, traditionally a very industrial place known as the Steel City. Although that has shifted recently, and places like this are becoming a more important part of the local economy. And there are other parties too showing an interest in this area. The Lib Dems obviously famously had an MP here who was very prominent, Nick Clegg, the leader under the coalition, or the deputy leader at the time of the coalition. Today we're going to chat to a few people down at this wall to get a flavour of what people here are talking about. John, you run this place. You've got a great little cafe in the background there. Is the election and the shenanigans that are going on today, is that the sort of thing that cuts through in the chat in there?
So, I'm not hearing too much of it just now. I think as we get a bit closer to the election, you know, people will start chattering about it. But no, not something I'm hearing too much about just yet.
And what are the issues that are getting you going? What are you interested in politically?
Yeah, so probably the 2 main interests for myself, someone in my mid to late 30s, housing, how can I get on the property ladder? Is it affordable? People in this kind of job, this kind of environment, can they afford to buy a house? That seems like something that's pretty reasonable to ask. And then the environment. As climbers, we like climbing indoors, but we like getting out to the Peak District, we like getting out to the national parks, climate change, the impact on the environment, all that sort of stuff. Those are the things that sort of get me going.
Can I see if that's a view shared by other climbers? Am I right to grab these guys over here? Right, guys, can I coax you down from the wall for a chat? Right. Tell me, what are the issues you want to hear politicians talking about?
Well, we're both students, and I think obviously there's a lot of issues, but like the first thing that comes to mind is probably like rental housing and stuff. You know, I've just done 2 years of uni, and that's 2 years of landlords that can sort of feels like they can get away with a lot, and it's definitely something that you sort of forget about a little bit. And I think just in terms of the actual election itself, it's a really awkward time for students because a lot of our leases end at the end of June, and obviously it's right at the start of July, so you've had to sort of re-register with the new accommodation or new housing if you want to vote at your uni accommodation. So, yeah.
Is that an issue that you're interested in too, housing?
Yeah, and I'm in my final year. I'm just graduating now. So I think what Declan was saying, and also just, well, I have to look for a job next year. Not sure how easy that's going to be, especially as I study humanities. And also, yeah, I just feel like students aren't represented.
Do you know who you're going to vote for? Are you still undecided?
I'm still undecided, probably Labour or Green, but I need to look more into it.
Yeah, same. I need to sort of look at tactical voting and whether I want to go with my heart or go with what might be best for the general outcome.
Yeah.
Gee, you were climbing up in the background. What are the issues that you're thinking about?
I say personally, and I think I probably speak for a lot of people within my age range anyway, I'm 30 plus, renting, mortgages, it's all really difficult at the moment.
What's your personal situation?
My personal situation at the moment is a bit of a sticky one. So we've not really had any protection as somebody who rents. So we've got a month to move out of our place. We're currently in between places. Luckily we have a camper van. But we're not in a position where we can just pick up a rental. That's £1,000 a month. We've got 2 dogs. So it's a bit of a tricky one, and mortgages aren't easy to come by. So for us personally, I think that that's a really important thing to be considering.
Do you think the politicians are connecting with people like you?
I don't I can't
Are you excited
say
at all?
that. I mean, I'm psyched to see some change, that's for sure. It's about time.
Well, Joe, that's just a little snapshot of what people here at the Climbing Wall are saying in Sheffield. As we say every time, this is just a flavour. It can't be representative of all of Sheffield. And if you're interested in who's standing across the city, there's a full list at the BBC News website.
Oh, Jim, thank you very much. We don't need to reprise the housing discussion we've had, but just as a sort of reaction to what you heard there, Mercy.
Yeah, it's very unsurprising. I mean, young people, all they want to do really is find a decent job, earn a decent living and be able to rent somewhere affordable or buy their own house, and they haven't been able to do that. We saw those figures for young home ownership down to 40%. And so I'm not surprised then that in despair, some of these young people, that's a horrible circumstance to be in.
Yeah, in despair, but undecided about, a lot of them, about how they're going to vote. It is a snapshot. It is anecdotal in that sense. But does that surprise you that only a few weeks out, a lot of people haven't decided who they're going to back?
It doesn't surprise me, no. I think there are millions of people around the country who still haven't decided which way they're going to vote. That's why, you know, I don't think there's any political party that really wants to take any vote for granted, and that's why any talk of what happens after election day is just, you know, is a bit nuts, because every single vote is up for grabs at the moment, and certainly on behalf of my party we'll work right up until 10 o'clock on polling day to win as many as possible.
Well, that may be a good point to show you this, which is on the front page of the Telegraph, and it's pretty apocalyptic if you're a Conservative. The Daily Telegraph says, Tory wipeout. You can see the map there on the left, dominated by blue, turning to red, a red wave. Giles, looking at that, what do you think?
Well, my heart doesn't leap, does it? I mean, it makes grim reading. Yeah, I thought we would be performing better this far into the campaign. I really did. I thought the gap would be closing. I still think the gap will close. I think we have to do significantly better than that. I'm still in it to win it. You have to be in it to win it because, well, you have to be, because we have hundreds, thousands of activists knocking on doors, and it would be completely disingenuous of me. No, it would be wrong of me, not disingenuous, it would be wrong of me to come onto this programme and say, well, it's all over, because I'm not knocking on doors. They're the ones knocking on doors. They're the ones supporting candidates in all these seats to try and get them back into Parliament or turn them into members of Parliament. But it looks really, really bad.
But you're surprised, and is that because you don't think people have made up their minds? You think the polls are wrong? And there have been quite a number of them. That's the most apocalyptic, and we'll talk about the sort of methodology in a minute. But what...
So I asked myself this last week, why am I Conservative? I'm a Conservative because I believe in sound money. And I think the party's suffering from a long Boris and short Liz, where we drifted away from sound money, we became profligate, we took the electorate for granted. Look, interest rates were always going to go up, but they went up spectacularly quickly as a result of Liz Truss's budget. And we're paying a price for that right now. People are genuinely cross with us. Now, the Prime Minister, Rishi, has got us back to sound money, which is inflation at 2%, that you can have real growth, real increase in living standards, proper increases in the share of wealth that goes to the public sector and the state. But you know, that's going to take time to sink in, and we're out of time, so that's why it's so difficult.
Well, just to put it into context, what I showed you there on the front page of the Telegraph was the latest of what we call MRP polls. It was for the Telegraph by Savanta and Electoral Calculus. There have been others, Ipsos Mori and YouGov, with differing outcomes, but all of which have Labour on over 400 seats, which is a huge majority. Let's speak now to Professor Paula Surridge, who is with us again from last week, and you're a political sociologist, amongst other things. What are MRP polls? How do they work, Paula?
So they work by taking a much bigger sample than a normal opinion poll, so that you can work out how particular types of voter are changing. So they look, for example, at a young female voter in the southwest, and then what they will do is, once they've found out how all those little groups vote, those much smaller groups vote, they project that into the constituencies. So they look at how many young female voters there are in a constituency, for example. There's many more variables than that go into it, but that's the basic idea. You find out how particular groups are voting, and then you project those back into the constituencies.
Are they more accurate, Paula, than other polls?
That depends what you want to do. There's a different purpose to them. The headline polling doesn't give you a breakdown by seats. So you always need some kind of way of transferring those headline polls into seats. And there's lots of different ways of doing this. So these ones do it by trying to get down into that real detail. And famously in 2017, the YouGov MRP was particularly accurate. And that's developed something of a kind of mystique around these techniques. But they are only as good as the data that they're putting in. If all the polling was off, all these MRPs would be off as well.
Is it possible that these polls will influence voter behaviour by focusing on the level of individual constituencies rather than just the national picture?
So that is one of the uses that some people try to put these to, particularly in an election where there might be issues around tactical voting, where it might not, new constituency boundaries and things like that, it might not be clear to people who to vote for to get the outcome they want. And actually in this election, that's true on both the left and the right in terms of the competition between the Conservatives and Reform. But what we find actually is that even with all this data, voters are not necessarily very clear about who's the best person to vote for to achieve the outcomes that they do.
But stay.
And after,
Finish your thought.
After elections, people rarely tell us that they voted tactically. So during the campaign, lots of people say they will. And then when we ask them afterwards, very few people say they did. So it's a bit unclear what the scale of the impact might actually be.
Well, stay with us. James, the polls are saying that Labour would get at least 400 seats. Is that what you're recognising on the ground when you're out campaigning?
No, look, I think the difficulty with these polls is that they don't seem to, in my experience, reflect the fact there are a large number of undecided people when we're knocking on the door who we still need to make the case through over the next 2 weeks. And I think a lot of these seats as well are quite tight, are quite marginal, so the majorities are quite small. So even a small change in people's voting habits could come up with a very different outcome. And that's why it's so important for us to say, look, to people, if you want that change, you've got to vote for it. And that's the only way we can get change on the 4th of July.
Are these polls changing the way elections are being reported, Mercy?
I think they're certainly interesting, especially when you look at the development of Reform, for example, and how well they've been doing. They're obviously a new party, didn't exist at the last general election. I think with these, but I don't know if it's this specific one, but Reform is ahead in 100 or so seats, perhaps more than that. So it's interesting in terms of looking at the dynamics at the sort of constituency level. And I think the rise of Reform in particular is something that the Conservatives should be quite worried about.
Well, I mean, I'll come to Daisy in just a second. How worried are you by Reform? I might be able to just show the BBC poll tracker. I don't know if we've still got it, because it gives a sort of spread, if you like. You can see general election voting intention. Now, just to inform people, you can see a little dip there in both Labour and the Conservatives. Still 20-point difference, Labour ahead by 20 points. But both Labour and Tories are down 3 percentage points since the beginning of the election to 41% and 21% on average, respectively. And this is just general voting intention, different to the polls that we have been looking at. But even so, it's the Reform which are ticking up that are posing what looks like a huge problem too for the Conservatives.
So you asked me how worried I am by Reform. Straight answer to a straight question. Very worried, incredibly worried. Now I'm hoping, because as Mercy has said, it's a new party, that the support it's currently polling is soft support and will drift back mostly to the Conservatives. There could be some in there for other parties, but mostly the Conservative will drift back to us. If it doesn't, we are in terrible, terrible trouble.
Right, and that might be wipeout then, in following up the logic of what
Those are
you
your
said.
words.
Yeah,
well,
I'm just posing.
Terrible, terrible trouble.
The Liberal Democrats are up 2 points to 11% in the same period, but less than Reform. Why aren't you picking up more of the protest votes, do you think?
Well, I think when you look at real results in real elections, what you can see is that Liberal Democrats have done incredibly well over the course of the last Parliament. We had those 4 stunning by-elections, we did really well in local elections, and we're winning in those places critically where we're in second place to the Conservatives. I think what the polls often hide is the question of, who do you not want to vote for, and would you be willing to vote tactically? And actually, there are many places across the country where the Liberal Democrats are the key challengers to the Conservatives. People are prepared to vote tactically to oust the Conservative MP.
Paula, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm sorry we haven't got time to go back to you, because that's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me, and I'll be back with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and at the iPlayer. So please keep me company tomorrow. But from all of us here, have a very good afternoon. Bye.